All right, hello dear friends, my name is Michael Samarin. I work with the Futurice, and I'm heading our cloud offering here in Finland, our cloud upscaling and our cloud partnerships. In fact, pretty much most of the technology partnerships with Microsoft, AWS, Google, Databricks, Snowflake, our wonderful friends UpCloud. So thank you very much, Ilka, for inviting me here to speak. I spent half of my professional career at Futurice, 18 years, so I've been around. And this topic today that I would like to talk is actually quite hard. And it's hard for multiple reasons. So basically, this is our challenge today. And I'm pretty sure that sooner or later or already you have some thoughts what to do, some concerns. And the challenge that we are facing today, it didn't start today. It's actually a long time challenge, and it's the writing on the wall. But the fact is why it's so hard, because I guess most of us spend a significant part of our professional careers with the public cloud, with AWS, with Microsoft, with Google, and starting to think how we decouple and how we pivot, how do we start using something different is very hard. So I'm expecting some probably even emotions, some resentment, and for some internal conversations that I had before, it might get quite heated. The important message that I would like to deliver today, let's try to take a look with very sober and cold look at actual facts of the current conflicts of the legislation, of what we have as an alternative. Do we have some solutions? How we discuss with our colleagues at AWS, Microsoft, etc. And the most important, how do we build services here in Finland? What we should be concerned about, right? So this is attempt to have this a sober look of some legalities. And this is essentially what we would like to achieve. So we would like to have data, well, essentially the digital sovereignty, so that at least, if not on an EU, at least on a national level, everything that we build can operate independently, regardless of what kind of changes in the international legislation. And the most important part, that the data and services that we build and provide are subject of only one legislation of the place where we provide them and where it's located. And this is very difficult, actually. This is a difficult topic to discuss. And the challenge is because we have this big conflict of laws. And as many of you might guess, on one hand, we have GDPR, which is very strict. It has very significant penalties, and essentially, for the past several years, it guides everything that European companies and we here in Finland with our customers are doing. From the other hand, we do have US Cloud Act, which essentially in direct conflict with GDPR. Literally direct conflict. You can't have both ways. So basically, in a nutshell, of course you can go to the official documentation and read the entire law, but in a nutshell, US administration can force absolutely legally with the court order for any US cloud provider to hand over data which is located in the EU. It doesn't matter actually where it's located. So this is a big big problem. And I would like to stress that this issue didn't start with the current US administration. And everything that we are talking about today, this is an official US foreign policy that's been there, if not for decades, but at least for the past decade. So this is absolutely nothing new. And in fact, the original US Cloud Act, I think it was started to be enforced in 2018. So not even the current administration. Of course, with the geopolitical events of today, we have quite a sober look at what's happening around and what can happen, but this problem is not new. And since this is not a new problem, how EU and US were trying to kind of bridge this legal gap. And we do have at least several attempts to bridge the gap. But this is the impact, the current impact of what can be with the US Cloud Act, which is right now active. Extraterritorial reach. Essentially, any US company is subject of this law, meaning that it doesn't matter if they're providing services in the EU territory. All companies are subject of this law. The interesting part that we assume, for example, if we work with the Microsoft Finland or Microsoft LLC in Luxembourg or AWS EU Sovereign Cloud GmbH, etc., they are all subsidiary and they're automatically subject of this law. So this is kind of the first problem. The second problem is, of course, a direct conflict that with the data in Frankfurt, US can issue a legal order to seize the data or get access to that. And the legal reality is complying with the order will violate GDPR. And the issue that, for example, cloud provider will comply, they might be subject of an EU penalty, but you are, or not you, but European company, which is providing services, if data was handed over, it's actually their fault according to the legislation. So basically, by doing nothing, you can be, waking up one day and you are a subject of GDPR penalty. And so what do we have else? We have actual public acknowledgement from the executives of the cloud providers under the oath that they cannot provide any legal guarantees that the data will not be handed over. And again, how the gap was attempted to be bridged, and we have a history. Yeah, go ahead.
About the second bullet on the previous slide,
yeah.
So that is there a need for this court order for that, or,
yes.
Or is it just that the cloud provider can actually do it without any court order?
If we're talking strictly legal, it has to be a court order.
Okay.
Yeah, it has to be a court order. There are issues where it's not needed, and I will cover this a bit later, and it's much more scary than what I showed right now. Mm-hmm. So the first attempt was called Safe Harbor Agreement, and it was actually invalidated in 2015. So the first attempt has failed to bridge the gap. Then there was a second attempt that was invalidated actually in 2020. It was called Privacy Shield. However, it was challenged in the court and it has failed. And the names, Schrems 1, Schrems 2, these are just the names of the cases based on a person who actually started the legislation. But this is a fact, and currently we live under the third attempt, and many of you probably know this. So this attempt is called EU-US Data Privacy Agreement, or DPF. And so this is a current attempt to bridge this gap. So that, for example, how does this mechanism work? Essentially, it's essentially a register, electronic register, where a provider tag themselves so that under the EU agreement and US agreement, they are entering into this data privacy framework, meaning that when you upload your data, for example, to a server somewhere outside Europe, you are still covered by this DPF, of course, under all the limitations of the GDPR. However, the big challenge that we have now is that it's been challenged already in the court, it's highly unstable, and it will fail. So it's not the fact if, it's fact when. It will be invalidated again. And another big problem is that DPF is based on the agreements with the FTC, Federal Trade Commission of the US, which is in their turn currently is in constitutional crisis right now as we speak. with the hearing scheduled for the summer of 2026. So it doesn't matter if it will be invalidated in Europe or in the US, it will fail most probably during this year. And this is a reality where we live today. And this affects all of us, whether by action or inaction. I mean all of us as providers of the services who are developing and deploying to the US-based public cloud providers. So this is our reality today. So we can scrap that. And now let's talk about some very interesting events of last year, when basically we have started to see very challenging geopolitical situations. Apologies for the wall of text. You don't have to read it. I will just cover it. There was a hearing last summer, June 10, 2025, in French Senate, where Microsoft executives with following names were under the oath and giving the basically all the information that they obliged by law. And the challenge is that these are very public high figures at the Microsoft hierarchy, and they essentially represent Microsoft even though they are located in the EU. So, and these are the most important. So this is it's a fascinating, if you like, for example, crime novels, or if you would like to, if you read like, I don't know, James Headley Chase, like Perry Mason and stuff like that, you can actually find and read the hearing. It's very interesting, but the most important parts are, so this is a quote translated: can Microsoft guarantee legally that it will refuse a valid request from the US government to access data stored in France? And the answer was that no, I cannot guarantee that. So that's a literal translation. And then there was a deeper question: if there would be ultimate conflict of law, what is the Microsoft allegiance? And the answer was that it was, of course, a US allegiance, meaning that if they are pressured, they will hand over the data. And this was probably legally one of the like a single watershed moment of the last year, where there are no more guesses. So this is a legal precedent, and everything from that moment on is guided and covered by this. So none of the US cloud public providers can provide any legal guarantees that they will not follow US Cloud Act. As simple as that. So this is a reality that we live in today. And there were a couple of immediate fallouts. So for example, there's even name kernel admission. And the first one is that, for example, Google attempted to sell sovereign solution to the NHS, National Services in the UK, which was challenged then after that. So they were not able to do that because of essentially results of this hearing. Exactly the same, for example, in Germany, it's now forbidden to use M265 in schools. And these are just one of the kind of a few examples of like immediate knee-jerk reaction of this. But the reality is this is a public legal case which we can actually use as the basis for further discussion. What do we have as a reaction from all hyperscalers? If you are very actively involved, for example, with Microsoft or AWS for the past 2 months, many of us were actually flooded by the messages, communications, and offers regarding the EU sovereign offering. So, as we know, AWS just launched EU Sovereign Cloud GmbH with the first data center in Germany, with complete hardware, network isolation, etc., 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 etc. If any of you participated in Microsoft partner events of last week, apologies. There was a last week dedicated presentation by Microsoft Finland regarding EU Sovereign Cloud offering and minimizing impact of US Cloud Act, with the consequence like emailing to all the Finnish partners a very large presentation and documentation about that. But essentially, if we can summarize what is the current EU sovereign offering from hyperscaler, so we can call it like sovereignty by obfuscation, essentially. And it means that we offer it network isolation, hardware encryption, and organizational structure. For example, AWS is leading here with the organizational structure because all the employees of the EU, AWS EU Sovereign Cloud GmbH are European employees, absolutely isolated network with the all kinds of hardware solutions. But the fact is that none of this matters. So this is essentially a marketing theater. I might be a very strong words, so if my AWS colleagues will hear this, apologies. We've had these discussions multiple times, and also there is a promise. It has never happened in the past X amount of years that we handed over data, which also kind of questionable, and I will explain you why. And regardless of all of the discussions and promises, there are no legal guarantees. So if you challenge directly your colleagues at our kind of friendly companies, there are no legal guarantees, and they cannot be provided, of course, because all of the EU sovereign clouds are subsidiaries of the American companies, and that automatically makes them subject of the US Cloud Act. So this is a reality today. And what do we do? Well, let's first read some emails. So last week, after the launch of EU Sovereign Cloud, AWS sent out to all the partners the explanation of impact of US Cloud Act, and with the, I would say, attempt to minimize and soften the law. But I want to bring here a direct quote from the email. So this is a one-to-one quote. Cloud Act applicability. Here is the critical point. The Cloud Act applies to any cloud provider that operates in the United States or has a legal presence there, regardless of where their headquarters is located, meaning that they're implying that, for example, our dear friends at UpCloud, Scaleway, Overcloud, and Hertzner, so they're all subject of the US Cloud Act. Is this statement true? It is true, but it's not entire and complete truth. So that's the problem. So you cannot legally change this statement because it is true, but it's not entirely true. And the problem is that in the US Cloud Act, there is a special kind of a legal hook that if EU provider has a US subsidiary, then this subsidiary is absolutely no questions. This is a subject of US jurisdiction. And so there's no questions in that. And there is a special clause called possession, custody, and control. If US subsidiary has any of these over the data in the US territory, in the EU territory, it means that they can be a subject of US Cloud Act and they will hand over the data. And argument for the access, of course, because you do have possibility to access, and you are US subsidiary, meaning that you will hand over the data. And from the European side, of course, there is an argument against the access. And if organizational and technology structure of the subsidiary is not accessing the European data, then it's not subject of the European part of the agreement. And this is also current situation. As we know, for example, our friends at UpCloud, they have a strict isolation of their US entity, and they are challenging this. But this is also how, for example, when you have a discussion with your colleagues, AWS, Microsoft, Google Cloud, and you see the statements, so just make sure that you would check the actual complete reality. What else? Well, so far we've been talking about US Cloud Act. And if you notice any public debates in our local media in Europe, everything is circling around US Cloud Act. However, there is another legislation which makes US Cloud Act a child play, essentially. Anybody knows what I'm talking about, except Ilka? Any guesses? I do have fancy music here, so I prepared my soundboard. Anybody? This is so-called Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, Section 702. And this is probably the most important legislation that's currently active, which literally makes US Cloud Act an obsolete and not that scary. The fact that this is not a new thing, so it's been in action since, I believe, I might be mistaken, from the 70s. And it's been augmented multiple times, and extended and extended and extended, and it happens at regular intervals. However, the interesting part of the latest augmentation, which has happened in 2024, targeting specifically non-US personnel located outside of the United States. So essentially, this is kind of an interpretation, but again, you can publicly read this. Essentially, any US intelligence agency can force and target non-US personnel, can force any employee of the US company to perform surveillance actions. And this is a very important part. Unlike US Cloud Act, which requires a judge and a court order, this law does not require a court order. It's actually issued by a secret court, and it's automatically, or as they call legally, programmatically approved. It does not require any approval. And it often comes with a gag order, meaning that you are legally obliged to keep your actions in secret and lie about them, and it will be absolutely legal. So essentially, any US personnel can perform spying action, lie about it, and get away with it, and it will be 100% absolutely legal. And I would like to also stress, these are not the actions of the current US administration. This is a normal, long-term foreign policy. And what are the most critical and most scariest part of the augmentation in 2024, with all these fancy names, but essentially a definition of who is providing. Essentially anybody who has access to the equipment that provides communication services. So this is written in a law. And another important part is that it impacts both downstream and upstream, meaning that it can be actually an employee of a company, a security guard, or a janitor who will be legally obliged to insert and flash the hardware of a router or a server and get access to the, I don't know, like exposed RAM, etc., etc., etc. And it will be absolutely legal, and it will be done in secrecy, and nothing can be done about that. So this is an actual law that we have right now, and as you see, it has very important implications. So it makes, like, you know, the whole story of bring your own encryption keys absolute myth, because as long as you literally keep the encryption key and data at the any digital equipment is not transmitting that encryption key, you are of course fine. But the moment if you are performing any action in terms of the loading data analytics, having any transient access to the data, it means that it's exposed. And there are implications, for example, and again, I would like to stress these are implications that, for example, the French hearing, when they were pressed if, for example, any actions were performed under the Section 702, the answer was like in Mission Impossible, I cannot deny or confirm any of these actions. So basically saying, I don't know. And the implications are, is it the truth or is this person under the gag order? We don't know. And essentially, whenever we are talking about EU sovereign cloud isolated hardware, it can be that it's legally already modified. So, and this is basically a reality that we live today. And then there's a third, so this is kind of a second legal issue. So we have US Cloud Act, we have FISA, Section 702, and there's another legal issue. And this legal issue is executive orders and sanctions, which are essentially ad hoc implementation of any existing agreement, and any US company has to comply with that. And again, this is absolutely legal mechanism. There is no secrecy or anything in here. And probably the best example is last year, Microsoft suspension of accounts of the ICC. And basically in May of last year, they had to suspend one of the prosecutors' email accounts because of the sanctions against ICC, absolutely legal sanctions, and Microsoft, being a legal entity, has to comply. There's a good outcome of that, of course, that in October, Microsoft was decoupled from ICC, and they moved to OpenDAC and hosted completely in the European Union. So, and if you've been following the scene of OpenDAC during the past year, it has developed tremendously. So this is something to be concerned. All right, so these were all the legal parts. Now let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. So do we have time? Yes, we have.
I have a question about the
sure.
legal part.
Sure.
So what is considered the jurisdiction for this legality? Is it all, let's say, they say in the US it's all legal, but where's the jurisdiction of that legality? Is it global? Do they automatically enforce everything globally?
Of course not.
Do they have that?
They have jurisdiction over any American company. It doesn't matter where it's located.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much it.
So in a way, some stuff we don't have to agree that it's legal, even though they say that it's legal.
Yeah. But again, as Microsoft confirmed after the oath, they will comply, even if they're located in Europe.
Mm.
If it was a matter of non-US citizens, then it would be illegal here, but not illegal if that non-US citizen would migrate to US after prescribed.
I don't know. So basically, the FISA targets non-US citizens. And I mean, nobody. So we don't talk about Snowden revelations anymore. But if you remember, like Snowden revelations and prison programs, etc., these are all part of the FISA targeting US citizens also. As far as I understand, again, I'm not a legal expert, I'm just a cloud person. But this is something that is written in the law that current Section 702 targets non-US citizens. Yeah. All right, I promised that it will be quite sober, cold, and emotional. Let's get a bit more emotional, right? I would like you, friends, to scan the QR code. This is a Proton blog, and they have fantastic research of the Europe's tech sovereignty. You don't have to read now. Just like put a bookmark, because it covers pretty much almost all European countries. It's very lengthy, and you can see the apologies. You can see the methodology, etc. What they did is very interesting. They estimated, based on public data, all the public listed companies in Europe by country. They have very interesting research related to GDP, etc. But essentially, dependence of European country on US-based technology. let's concentrate on Finland only today, and 92% of Finnish publicly listed companies is dependent on US technology, meaning that, for example, this very famous kill switch can be applied. Essentially, Finland is under the control of a foreign entity, which has absolute control over everything. And I really recommend explore this very interesting read, and also gives you some perspective. And as I mentioned, so Finland covers 92% of all publicly listed Finnish companies are heavily dependent. And this is a reality because most of us helped build this. Do you feel responsibility? Yeah. So, and it's not an accident that we are here in UpCloud office talking about that. But what does it mean in practice? If, let's eliminate ill intentions, and if we just talk about technical problems. During the past 6 months, I made a map, not a map, I made a quick statistics, only AWS and Cloudflare. So the major disaster that affected a lot of us, October 20, when US East essentially went down, and it exposed the cascade nature that basically everything depends on US East. And what happens also, what we've been observing, that for example, many of the services rolled over properly to, for example, EU backups, etc. However, most of the authentication providers, they were so heavily based on US East that you could not, the service is live, but you could not access it because authentication doesn't work. So, and then just 8 days later, there was another major outage based on exactly the same US East. And a little bit earlier, there was another one. So this is just AWS. I didn't know, how about you? We've seen a major effect of this October 20 effect. So basically half of the day we were not able to work.
Yeah, I didn't even notice them until somebody mentioned, it's out again.
Yeah, but we were not able to work because a lot of the dependencies and a lot of dependencies for our customers. And Cloudflare, one of a time, the worst event as they explained since 2019, and never happened before, will never happen after that, and less than a month, another one, and last week, another one. And these are all, so by the way, these are not human errors, so these are automatic or automation deployment errors. So when we completely exclude humans, should I start talking about AI or? So, and the problem here, how do we operate locally in all our public services if we are reliant on the cloud providers, which are not even in the country? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, are you sure all of these have been accidents or kind of some secret orders to stop the systems and get some time to read the data in peace?
Depends on the mood. If I am in the crime investigative mood, so of course we can have all the theories, but I believe these are just technical failures. I hope. The challenge that we see here, if we talk about our public services, let's take transportation. HSL, you're buying tickets, it's running on Google. Where when you're buying tickets, it's running on AWS. We don't even have a data center of AWS in Finland. And Google, a data center in Hamina, very successfully sold. It's not independent. It will go down, exactly, it will go down in a few hours if we would lose internet connectivity. It's heavily dependent on the main Google consoles, essentially. Public services in terms of the health, etc., 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 etc. So, and of course, one doesn't have to be, thinking, but if you start thinking about Finland without internet, we are back to 19th century, essentially, within 24 hours. And again, this is how much control can be used but let's forget about ill intentions. Let's just talk about technical failures. And now let's talk seriously about Finland without internet. What will happen? And of course, we can talk about cable cutting scenarios, like satellites jamming, and think about foreign adversaries. But let's also just forget about this and let's just look only about the technical failures of cables and satellites. And now another question to you. Who knows what is Carrington event? There is one, yes. So, Carrington event, it has happened in 1859. It was just a major solar flare. We had rudimentary telegraph. It knocked out the whole telegraph system, burned down several telegraph poles, several machines, etc., etc., etc. Currently, it's estimated in whatever the units they are, like X something. So it was a major coronal mass ejection, and there was a sequence of the events, how Earth and Sun were located, but basically it was like direct hit, essentially. Since then, we have developed our electrical system a little bit. And one would assume that, well, it's a one-of-a-lifetime event. However, I was terrified to learn it's happening all the time, essentially. So I have a record here for the past 100 years. 1921, basically, telegraph, railroads, signals, towers burned down, and it's called New York Railroad Storm because essentially it's knocked out the railroads. If we look a little bit closer, 1972, a major storm exploded naval mines during the Vietnam War. So U.S. had naval mines. It's actually exploded them. It's because it's triggered the magnet sensors. And it hit right between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 launch. And it was just pure luck because otherwise the astronauts would not actually survive the impact of the radiation. If we closer, 1989, so-called Quebec blackout, it was X-15 flare, and it's collapsed the power grid in Quebec, causing blackout, and it's burned out transformers at the one of the U.S. nuclear power plants. If we closer to our modern time, 2003, called Halloween Storm, that was also direct impact. It actually caused major blackout in our neighbors in Malmö. So basically they were without electricity. It's actually burned out few satellites, and the ISS crew had to hide in a special place so that they would not be actually radiated. 2012, that was a major storm that is actually on the level of the original Carrington event. It just missed us. It's kind of a grazed, but it's missed us. If it would actually hit, we would be back to 19th century for a couple of years. So, and this is not an isolated event, and of course there are preparations for this kind of event, so there are modifications to the power grid. Major estimates were done after the 2012, including undersea cables. So we don't need the anchors dragging the sea to cut cables around Finland. We need just a major solar storm, and the repeaters would be burned down unless they are isolated like they're supposed to be. So what I'm saying is that we don't have to think about major adversary action. It just can be act of nature, and we will be without internet. And basically, all of us and the management of the companies that we are operating with, and all of you, we are living in a so-called, as I keep telling it, I'm reusing this slide all the time across multiple presentations. It's like a hope-based management. So the scary part, I'm using this slide for the past decade maybe in very different topics, and it actually applies in many different subjects. So, meaning that we really hope for the best, that nothing will happen until it happens. And it also brings me to two of my favorite movies, Jaws and Dante's Peak. So I'm pretty sure many of you know Jaws. I'm not sure about Dante's Peak. The idea is that the big boss essentially knows about the threat, makes conscious decision to ignore it, and then either himself, his close people, or actually the citizens are suffering the consequences. He was not eaten in Jaws. He was killed in helicopter crash in Dante's Peak. Sorry for the spoilers. So, like after paying up to the helicopter pilot, hoping to, escape after the bad decision on the last helicopter with the golden parachute. So, but this is kind of a, to lighten the mood. But this is something that is happening and potentially can happen. And of course, what do we do? So, otherwise it would be a pretty depressing talk, right? Hope for the best. What do we do?
Rent the movies.
Good idea.
Call Futurice for help.
Yeah. I would love to, but the answer is right here. We are sitting in their headquarters. And let's not pimp up the app cloud too much, but essentially, if we are starting to consider European options, and luckily we do have many, but if we are thinking about Finnish sovereignty, we do have a major cloud provider in here next door with 2 data centers here, and hopefully exploring and expanding their services. But in practice, of course, ultimate solution, hey, tomorrow just go to your workplace, start migrating everything, right? So it's not going to happen. We all realize it's not going to happen in a reasonable amount of time, but this is it, and it's not something you have to be prepared. You just have to start slowly planning and doing this. And I would like to actually, before showing like the first solution, I would like to talk about another accident, but it's a good one. So UniSuper, it's Australian fund, and so they are very large. So they have about like 90 billion fund to manage, and the outage started on May 2, 2024, and of course Google saying it was one of a kind, never happened before configuration error, but essentially they wiped out the full cloud account, including all the backups, including absolutely everything. So the company was eliminated. Why I bring here as a positive example? Because they were able to restore within a week. Why? Because of the solution that we have to start looking into right now, at least, and this is external backup. So they actually had very expensive third-party external backup. Rumor says it was Azure. We don't know that, but essentially it was another cloud provider where they had not only the data, but also the infrastructure, configurations, and everything else. So they were able to, with a week gap, they were able to roll back their services. They made a joint statement with Google, will never happen again, yada, yada, yada. But this is one of the first items that you have to do. Even, and the why people don't like backups, because they're expensive. So try imagining any of our local major enterprise handling the third-party backup outside of their cloud provider. But this is something that if we do have a backup of both data and infrastructure configuration in a local EU-based cloud provider, it means that we do have possibility to restore with the pain, with a huge amount of spendings, etc., but we are able to go back. The second part is, of course, I mean, we are not inventing here anything. Classification. You have to classify your data and workloads. There are two axes. Data sensitivity, in terms of like you can reverse this, whatever is more important for you. Because, for example, in here, public website content is not that much important, but all your internal data under GDPR is the most important. But essentially, do multiple level of classification and start moving from the most sensitive. And there is a second axis, workloads. Data is just one aspect. Actually, data can be relatively easily handled with backups, etc. But again, you can have multiple categories in terms of your, your secret sauce innovation, in terms of your core operations, and your standard IT functions, depending on what is the most important for you. So we are not inventing a wheel here, but once you do have this starts to at least help you to see if everything goes bad, where do you go? What is the step number 1? What is the step number 2? What is the step number 3? And of course, consider all 3 architecture models, like the 2 opposites, like 100% all in on European cloud, or either the hybrid, splitting the workloads based on the either legality of your solutions. We do have customers who are saying we don't care about legality, not because they are bad, but because it actually doesn't really affect them, but we actually care about operations, about speed, about costs, about access, etc. And of course, multi-cloud decoupling, so like spreading between multiple cloud providers, including the European cloud providers. So these are not some secrets, these are not new, but this is something that you have to do. And finally, these are 5 areas. You cannot defend anymore the monolithic monocloud approach. So this is something that you have to consider. You have to prioritize and classify by sensitivity, whether it's operational or legal sensitivity. And of course, with all the AI advances and the fact that the most advanced models and most advanced services are on US cloud providers, however, there are alternatives and you can use them in isolated, safe environments. Another important organizational part, in your organization, you have to establish the council. So bringing together IT, business, and legal to follow all of those changes in legislations and at least seeing what is the current status of potential spread of connectivity issues, network infrastructure, etc. And finally, of course, turn it into competitive advantage, because I noticed myself when I'm looking at certain services, if they are actually openly advertising that they are hosted on UpCloud, or so I'm interested. It's a marketing, of course, but this is something that can be an advantage. And basically, the true have a target for you, like a true digital sovereignty. And it goes beyond compliance, as I hopefully covered. It covers both legal aspects and the actual physical access and control, so that you can continue operating. If everything goes bad, you are out of network and you are isolated within a country. You can have operational plans if you are pressured by legal challenges. And finally, it's not only local data. This is something that goes beyond that. And I hope this talk would give you some food for thought. And please remember, there is always good guys next door, and of course we're here to help. Thank you very much.